More on Vaticano begins now. On June the 29th, Rome celebrates the patron saints of the city, Saints Peter and Paul. The feast was established in order to commemorate the martyrdom of these two pillars of the Catholic Church. It's always been usual in Christian art to represent the two saints together. Proof of this is that at the Sant'Angelo Bridge in Rome, it's both saints who welcome pilgrims into the Vatican. Their mutual connection is also visible in the fact that both basilicas in their names, St. Peter and St. Paul's, display identical statues of the two. We met with Elizabeth Lev, an art historian, to discover more about these two saints through the architecture of Rome.
One of the most important points about these two basilicas is this twinship between Peter and Paul. In Rome, as you know, we celebrate June 29th as one of our biggest holidays of the year, and we celebrate it as the day that Peter and Paul were both killed. And as a matter of fact, you see the images within the church of the beheading of St. Paul, the crucifixion of St. Peter, celebrated. They're always placed side by side, celebrated on the same day, because as the two apostles died here, they were born together in heaven. And that makes them twins. And for a city that loves twins, we were founded by Romulus and Remus. These new twin martyrs would be the ones that would refound the Christian city. And that is emphasized not only in the matching statues, but when the emperors rebuilt this church in the 5th century, they turned it. So no longer does it face like St. Peter's, like all the other churches. It doesn't face east. It faces west. It faces St. Peter's. So the two of them look at each other. The two brothers embrace across the city in the very urban planning of the two churches.
The celebration of the patron saints of Rome begins on the evening of June the 28th in the Vatican Basilica, when the statue of St. Peter is dressed as a pontiff. The feast continues with the Vespers the next day at the Basilica of St. Paul.
A very, very important appointment in this year, and with this church every year, is the time of June 29th, when we have the Vespers for the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, which take place here. As a matter of fact, this church has been charged for all sorts of ecumenical activities and initiatives. That's the job of this church, really. And so from the Week of Christian Unity, where it's featured very heavily, but perhaps the most beautiful moment of the year is when the Pope comes, usually with a representative of the Eastern Church. They pray together at the tomb of St. Paul.
The New Testament is our main source as to the lives of these two great apostles. However, the Holy Scriptures don't say when or how either St. Peter or St. Paul died. To find out more about their martyrdoms, we need to go inside the two churches bearing their names.
This is a site that started out as a tomb. It started out as a place of sadness and mourning. When St. Paul was killed, somewhere between 65 and 67, his body was brought back to a piece of property belonging to a woman who had been one of his followers. Her name was Lucina, and she owned a piece of property right here, a stone's throw from the Tiber and on the Via Ostiense, two main passages for the city. And the body was placed into what we're assuming was a very simple hole in the ground, with a few years later perhaps some sort of memorial placed on top of it, so that the first few pilgrims would be able to find the tomb of St. Paul. And then from there, with the moment of the legalization of Christianity, it blossomed into something greater and greater and greater.
Some skeptics don't believe that the remains of St. Paul are really present in the basilica. But on December the 6th, 2006, Vatican archaeologists confirmed the existence of a white marble sarcophagus beneath the altar and attributed it to St. Paul. The authenticity of the remains of St. Peter has also been confirmed. On June the 26th, 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the relics of St. Peter had been identified.
What happened with the tomb of St. Peter is that Peter was simply buried in a hole in the ground. He was executed in a horse racing circus, and being a pauper in a state of very, very violent persecution, the best his friends could do would be to take the body out of the horse racing circus, bring it to the first quiet space, dig a hole in the ground, put the body in it, cover it with some dirt, and cover it with some pieces of brick. And the amazing part of this story, and everything you see flowering behind it, is that this is the moment that the Romans finally made a mistake. It was the moment when it seemed that they had crushed out the Christians, they had rid themselves of this Christian presence, but actually inadvertently throwing that body in the hole in the ground, thinking they had taken out the trash, the Romans planted a seed. And we look at the flowering of that seed every time we look at the basilica, because the basilica is sitting directly on top of that tomb. If you start from the orb at the very top of that dome and drop a line down, it will drop through 2,000 years of history, through monuments and altars and makeshift walls, all the way down to the hole in the ground where the Romans first made the mistake of discarding that stone, which is Peter.
By following the gospel, Saints Peter and Paul became the founders of a new Rome and a new church, thus completely changing the course of human history.